So a question submitted by David: what's my favorite tide and depth to fish stripers on the California Delta? Now, if you have a tidal system, this may carry over to you, but on the California Delta, it's pretty specific to what we are targeting out there. It's mostly grass, it's shoals, it's hard, flat bottoms, but we do have these grass flats. So I kind of have variables to each tide, David. So what I'm going to tell you is, if it's incoming tide, I honestly like water 2 to 1 feet. And that's anywhere the water is 6 to 8 inches over the top of the grass line. The reason for this, I feel like you put a big swim bait, anywhere a striper can pin it in shallower water. This is why oftentimes, even with swim baits, even for bass, we're throwing deep and we're bringing it shallow. But in regards to stripers, we're typically keeping the boat on the Delta in 4 to 5 feet and casting shallower and bringing it back. So you're relatively in that same strike zone the whole time. A bigger striper likes to trap the swim bait in the shallowest water they can possibly get it. So what I want to tell you is, I've caught stripers 15 to 20 pounds in less than 20, 24 inches of water. Don't ask me how they disguise themselves so well. You can see the water just cut a big V in it and they shoot and get your bait, and it's like, I don't even know where that fish was sitting. So I prefer at least a 2 1/4 to 2.5 foot tide or bigger for targeting stripers. Now, if it's a bigger tide going out, I'm not going to venture inside a shallow flat too much. If it's outgoing tide, I'm going to put the boat probably in 4 to 5 feet to start and start fan casting the flat from the outside and work my way towards the shallows. If it's an incoming tide on that same basis, what I'm going to do is I'll probably put my boat on the incoming. Just depends on the position of the tide. But if it's almost full, I'm probably going to put my boat in 3 and try to cast to that 1. I may have ran fish over, but typically that striper is going to go all the way into 1, 1.5, 2 foot to attack those baits. They want to pin them up there dirt shallow. Under a 2 foot tide, man, it could be really difficult. I feel like a lot of the Delta stripers are not overly active at that point. So sometimes I will put down like a big glide. I'll put down the top water, and that's where I'll go with like a smaller soft plastic paddle tail swim bait, or a vibrating jig with a swim bait trailer on the back, or even a traditional fluke or a Magnum fluke if I'm targeting bigger stripers. So the slower that tide, I feel like you have to be, the smaller that tide, let me clarify, I feel like you have to be right on them. Moving tide, they're actively feeding. There's a lot of food passing by them. So your glide baits and your bigger baits, always your bigger tides up to, 3.5 is going to fish really well. 2.5 to 3.5 are typically going to fish best. I've typically had my best luck fishing outer grass flats, always on the outgoing tide. I feel like if you have a very large, expansive area of shallow grass flats and the tide's halfway out, it's going to condense the fish on the outer weed line instead of them pulling down into deeper water sooner, especially if that water's still trucking along and moving real good. Now, same thing on the incoming tide. If you're on the upper half or the upper third of that incoming tide, I feel like that's when the ponds on the Delta fish really well. I'm not going to name them because people crucify me. Any of the big flooded pond areas, any of the lake-looking areas that come off that main Sacramento River, that's where they fish really well. So if you're, let's say you're in one of those flooded ponds and the water's already at 2 feet and it's coming up 3 1/4, that's the best time to get in there and look for high spots inside those flooded ponds. Look for dense areas, look for structures or harder bottoms or gaps in the weeds. If you see a lot of weeds in a flooded pond and you see a gap, that's only a couple feet deep, or you see a grass lane, those big stripers will utilize that. Unless they're actively targeting something, then they will move right into the grass, but don't outrule ankle deep water. Believe it or not, there's been times where I felt like I was skunked most of the day, and next thing you knew, I threw in water that was almost less than a foot, and I see a fish shoot out a 2 foot and dang near belly themselves in the dirt to get that big bait. So if I had to pick a favorite tide, I'm going to say probably somewhere around 3 foot on the outgo. That's where I've typically caught my bigger, better stripers. But I kind of like them all unless they're less than a 2 foot tide, because those usually suck.